Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming today. So today I am going to be presenting the overarching argument and several of the empirical pieces from my book with Amber Wichowsky at the University of Wisconsin, along with a few extensions and working papers. So I'm going to show you the broad currents, how the broad currents of politics and inequality in the United States are driven by the simple comparisons that we all make with other people. While our book focuses on the American context, I do want to say that I think that the broad arguments about how the psychology behind the perception of inequality work translate beyond and across national borders, and I look forward to questions about that, hopefully in the Q&A. So I want to begin with a simple premise. The human imagination is an engine of comparison. We get our bearings in a complex and changing world by comparing ourselves to other people. These comparisons shape the way we see the social order and ourselves. They govern our desires and our discontents, and they are often very automatic. They're driven by context and impulse, so much so that they happen just beneath our awareness. But often, if you think about it, you can recognize them. So before I jump into the research today, think for a second about what comparisons you have already made yourself this morning. Did you compare yourself to neighbors or to other scholars, to people in the media, online, or on the street, even just for a moment? Why do you think you made these particular comparisons and not others? Did you try to avoid or stop thinking about any comparisons that might have felt a bit uncomfortable? Did the comparisons that you made bring you up, bring you down? Did you aspire, covet, envy, pity, condescend? And then, do you think that these kinds of everyday comparisons matter for the way you see politics? So in the book, we look at similar questions, but from a much broader perspective. What kind of social comparisons are encouraged by an increasingly unequal American context? Do we compare downward and feel great, or upward and feel little? And what are the consequences for our shared political and economic future? For as great thinkers have reminded us for centuries, nothing is great or little otherwise than by comparison. Social comparison can take many forms, but I'm going to talk today about cross-class comparison. In the real world, context and psychology combine to direct attention up toward the rich or downward toward the poor, and govern the images that come to mind when we make those comparisons. So my core questions today are: how often, under what conditions, and with what political consequences do these cross-class comparisons occur? On one hand, there's reason to believe that downward comparisons might dominate. Imagining lower status others is a really efficient way to feel confident and secure, satisfying what has been called the drum major instinct, the desire to be out in front of the parade. Thinking of other people as inferior can produce self-confidence and buoy our sense of self. So great thinkers like Martin Luther King Jr. and Virginia Woolf, quoted here, recognize this. And contemporary social scientists, especially in psychology, have repeatedly confirmed the observation. Downward comparison can elevate a person's sense of their own status, even when markers of status like money or education or achievements don't change. So in an era today marked by rapidly growing economic insecurity, my co-author and I thought perhaps people might be especially drawn to this sort of downward comparative thinking driven by a desire to elevate the self. What might the consequences be for politics? Both Woolf and King emphasize that comparison with others structures not only individual perception and self-concept, but power relations. King argued that the drum major instinct lies at the roots of racial resentment, because people often satisfy their drive to compare downward by focusing on members of marginalized racial groups. And Woolf made a similar argument about gender. She viewed this drum major instinct as foundational to patriarchy. In both cases, you'll notice that a drive away from upward comparison and toward downward comparison serves to reinforce unequal power relations. Unlike downward comparison, upward comparison can foster anxiety. It can also weaken confidence and lower perception of status. So my favorite example of this, of all research, is the case of the sad silver medalist. Okay? So in picture after picture at the Olympics, you'll notice that the person who's objectively done better than bronze looks the saddest. And psychologists have done some research on this, and it turns out that the reason is social comparison. So while the bronze medalist compares downward, thinking of all the people who didn't make the podium and feeling elevated, the silver medalist tends to compare upward at gold and feel a sense of loss. So in short, our perception of our own status and our attitudes about where we stand are not simple functions of our resources or even our absolute place in a hierarchy. They are products of comparison. So when a palace or a gold medalist springs up next door, the house shrinks to a hut. And yet, whether we're looking back into history or into the mirror of present popular culture, we find many examples of upward comparison. So Americans in particular have a long-standing appetite for news from the top. From Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Carnegie to self-help books that are still popular today, like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and reality shows. Our elected leaders, increasingly hail from the upper classes in the United States. And modern celebrity culture just absolutely relentlessly drives attention to what we might think of as the gold medalists in today's society. So in particular, when it comes to American political rhetoric, there's certainly no shortage of upward comparison. Candidates and leaders, perhaps especially on the left, seem almost unaware of how bad upward comparison can feel to people. So progressives, so here we have Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, consistently direct Americans' attention to disparities between the rich and the rest, telling Americans to look around. Oil companies guzzle down billions in profits. Billionaires pay lower taxes than their secretaries. Wall Street CEOs, the same ones that direct our economy and destroy millions of jobs, still strut around Congress, no shame, demanding favors, acting like we should thank them. Look up. In fact, we actually see upward comparison messaging echoing from both sides of the political aisle. So here is another quote from an American political elite. Globalization has made the financial elite who donate to politicians very, very wealthy, but it has left millions of our workers with nothing but poverty and heartache. That is not a liberal Democrat, it's Donald Trump. So are these politicians shouting into a void? Remember, people hate the silver medalist vantage point. We don't like to compare upward. And yet here are candidates trying to win votes, repeatedly asking Americans to look up. And such populist rhetoric is certainly not restricted to the US context. We wondered if we could nail down how people respond to upward comparison. And we also wanted to look beyond political messages, because even though these are important to all of us, the vast majority of social comparative experience that people have is interpersonal in our daily lives. So what about those other comparisons that we make throughout our days? To answer this question, we have to learn a little bit more about social comparison. So some of you who aren't involved in the Pear Fair Project might wonder why I have pictures of kids up here. Well, it turns out that we compare ourselves to others starting at a very young age. And that can tell us something about how social comparison works. So I regularly hear my own children comparing themselves to their siblings about how they're taller or shorter or faster or, all sorts of things. And these sorts of comparisons, developmental psychologists tell us, help cognitive development. Because social comparisons are often how we understand social arrangements that are new or unfamiliar. So your Pear Fair team is at the cutting edge of the study of political implications of this sort of thinking in adolescence. And as we progress into adulthood, our use of social comparison matures with us. So we routinely rely on them to process information more efficiently and make judgments. And just as with children, social comparisons are particularly important when people are faced with social structures that are complex or unfamiliar. Think inequality. And yet, social comparison across class lines has received very little attention in many prominent attempts to understand the response to one of the most complex and rapid shifts in the social order in a generation, the dramatic rise in inequality since the middle of the last century. In part, due to this oversight, we're left with many unanswered questions. Public opinion in the United States has not responded to rising income inequality the way many researchers and experts expect and predicted that it would. So the longstanding expectation, I would imagine many of you are familiar with, has been that as inequality increases, more people fall farther from the top, and the public will demand more redistributive action to remedy that situation. Support for government response will grow, yet the reality runs contrary to this expectation. So Americans have a lot of trouble identifying their own position in a changing economic hierarchy. And the appetite for economic redistribution has remained relatively stable for decades. The connections between Americans' opinions and socioeconomic status, which we as social scientists tend to measure by looking at incomes and resources, remain weak and hard to predict. So maybe, why not more demand for redistribution? Maybe Americans are ignorant, lacking the factual knowledge to respond rationally to growing inequality. Or maybe they're tolerant and accepting of inequality because of fierce individualism, ideology, deeply held beliefs about capitalism, mobility, and the American dream. But perhaps instead, people are not responding to inequality in expected ways because they are increasingly insulated from the upward social comparisons that make inequality real and meaningful in the social mind. So what you're looking at here is the richest street in America, and it's telling that it is actually an island. We're going to approach the mysteries about economic inequality and politics in a slightly different way. So we know that economic inequality alters people's objective socioeconomic status, affecting both the demands they make on government and what they want government to do. But subjective status perceptions are also an important part of this process. And as I've already discussed, these perceptions are determined in large part by social comparison. So I'm going to show in particular when people look up at the rich, they feel lower, and when they want government to increase social spending. But three countervailing forces get in the way. First, to understand the relationship between inequality and politics, we have to take a step back and investigate the opportunities people have or lack to confront those who are economically different. So the availability of the target here. In particular, I'm going to show you that a test and that we show that in increasingly unequal America, growing class segregation limits opportunity for upward comparison. Second, growing economic anxiety increases a desire for downward comparison to boost a sense of self in the midst of anxiety-producing change. So both of these forces seriously limit the upward comparisons that people are making in their minds, interrupting the connection between inequality and political demands. So third, when upward comparisons do happen, they make people want more action from government, but they also depress political efficacy, making people feel less confident about their own capacity to get in the ring and affect change. Now, because I'm interested in understanding the response to economic inequality, in the book, we focus on cross-class comparisons, but we point out that social comparative thinking can never be scrubbed of race and gender the way statistical information can be. So we also examine, and I'll talk a little bit today, about the ways in which the intersection between class, race, and gender influence both which comparisons Americans make and how they respond to them. Race and gender undergird all of the forces in this model. They structure opportunity for cross-class contact. They increase anxieties. They shape stereotypes of the rich and poor, and they provide a means for many people to avoid thinking in uncomfortable class-based ways. Cross-class social comparison also interacts with race and gender to affect people's political attitudes more than others in some cases. And so in all of these ways, attention to social comparison reveals the impossibility of solving mysteries about class and American politics without investigating race and gender. Throughout the book, Amber and I point out the many ways in which race and gender determine the nature and impact of cross-class comparison. And again, I'll highlight a few of those as I talk today about the results. And in doing so, I'm aiming to complicate what I think has become an oversimplified and unfortunate dichotomy, especially in the US, between class politics and what we sometimes call identity politics. These are actually very integrated in people's perception of inequality. All right, so we draw on many data sources and methods to put this theory to the test, and I'm going to talk more about them in just a moment. But our core method is an experimental manipulation in which we ask large, nationally representative samples of Americans to imagine a conversation with someone from the top or the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. So we show subjects the MacArthur ladder of objective social status. It's a 10-rung ladder, and ask them to imagine that the rungs of the ladder represent where people stand in the United States. And we ask them to contrast themselves to this imagined other at the bottom or the top. So thus we're able to manipulate experiences of social comparison, holding people's resources and ideology and values and social circumstances constant. So our book draws on a wealth of experimental and observational data. We conduct our main experiment with 2 separate nationally representative samples of American adults through the time-sharing experiments in the Social Sciences Project, each with about 1,000 participants. In addition, our experimental manipulation in these large experiments includes a free writing exercise where people reflect on imagined interactions with someone at the top or the bottom. And we leverage these responses of people in the treatment conditions. There are about 1,300 in total, to explore the images that come to mind and the emotions that are engendered by cross-class comparison. We take a distinctly qualitative interpretive approach to examining these data, and I'm going to give you a little taste, but I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A. We also analyze throughout the book observational data to see whether the experimental results match up with what we see in the real world. We look at primarily data from the General Social Survey and the American National Election Study. And then there are a host of supplemental experiments with convenience samples that we use to replicate and dig more deeply into causal questions that our main experiments uncover. Okay, so first let's look at Americans' response in their own words. So who do they imagine when they think of the rich and the poor, and what attitudes and reactions do those imagined others spark for them? So again, we have over 1,300 written responses from 2 large nationally representative samples. In the book, we devote 2 whole chapters to the interpretation of these results. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on some of the main themes and then turn to the experimental results and spend most of my time on that today. I'll just give you a taste here. So Americans certainly do resent the rich. I'm just showing you some of the responses here. Someone says, "I do not think the people at the top of the ladder would have anything to do with me. That's fine with me," all in capitals. But they also express admiration and personal inferiority. This person is saying, "When I think about or interact with anyone wealthy, I always feel like what I say is being dissected or not important enough," all in lowercase. We find some sympathy in people who are asked to contrast themselves with the poor. People don't express a lot of sympathy. They don't write a lot about it, but they do say that they would be, they claim sympathy and empathy. But it's repeatedly qualified or walked back. So in the same comments where they say first, "I would be empathetic, I would worry about them, I would be sympathetic," the same person says, "However, I would also expect this person to help themselves. I don't particularly like lazy and therefore would have to believe in the sincerity of this person before I would take the extra step to assist." So we in the book call this the American if. I would be sympathetic if they were good enough or nice enough or not lazy or all these things. Racialized and gendered class images persist throughout these comments. This person says, I pictured single mothers with children. Their children are poorly dressed. They all have phones, indicating some sort of luxury of sorts, and are heavy set. And thinking about the economic other, the rich or the poor, induces people to make self-referent evaluations. So even though we're directly, explicitly asking them to think about, describe what they think about the other person, they talk about themselves. So people say things about their status in all kinds of ways. That's one example, I feel uneducated. Okay, so revisiting the model, I'm going to begin with how social comparison now affects the perception of status. So Americans see themselves broadly as middle class, and this isn't restricted to the American context. We saw some examples in the Perfair data of this middle class bias among children in Germany. So this middling tendency is part of our political culture. In the United States, there's pride in being part of the middle class. What you're looking at here is just self-perception in the general social survey, people who put themselves at the top, the middle, or the bottom, and you can see with the solid line, most people are placing themselves in the middle class. Here, you're looking at misperceptions of relative social position in a different way. So this is the average distance or difference between subjective self-placement, like on that 10-rung ladder, so people's perceived decile, and their objective percentile ranking, adjusted for their household size in the income distribution. This is from the General Social Survey, and we had to like double check when this figure came out because it just looks like so perfectly tidy. But you see here that people on both ends of the income spectrum are misperceiving their status really as a function of how far they are from the middle. People are doing this across contexts, and they're really interesting. I know we have some sociologists in the room. We have really interesting qualitative other studies by sociologists really digging into this and showing how people are building their status perception based on their context and misperceptions. So sociologist Rachel Sherman, for example, finds with surprise that some of the wealthiest New Yorkers who are in the top 1% nevertheless describe themselves as middle class because they're comparing themselves to the top, 1/10 of a percent. And at the lower rungs of the ladder, Americans work very hard to distance themselves from the bottom through, a phenomenon called last place aversion, and they do so by comparing themselves to someone worse off. So sociologist Sarah Meakin Halpern, in her study of earned income tax credit recipients who are objectively low income, quotes someone as saying, "It's not like I'm poor," and comparing themselves to someone who is even worse. So we test in our studies how social comparisons affect perception of status using the experimental manipulation that I was just talking about. As we see here, those in the upward comparison condition place themselves farther down the ladder than those in the downward comparison condition, as expected. We ran an additional experiment, it's not shown here, that likewise shows that downward comparison boosts one's sense of status relative to people who only saw the ladder and weren't directed to think upward or downward. And so we also show, this is in another experimental study, that lower status white Americans get an even bigger subjective status bump when we ask them to do the same thing. We ask them to compare downward, but we racialize the name of the person that we're asking them to compare with. Social comparison with the economic other furthermore makes us more accurate about our place in the income distribution. So here you see people above the median and below the median making downward and upward comparisons. And you see that if you think about someone at the far end of the spectrum, you grow more accurate about your actual place in an economic hierarchy. So we show that status perceptions are remarkably flexible. This is one imagined experiment in one survey. So indeed, in our open-ended responses to this manipulation, we find that getting Americans to think about the economic other gets them to think deeply about their own status. And when their attentions are drawn up in particular, they express a great awareness of the distance that separates themselves from the top. So letting us know, I don't know who those rich people are, but it ain't me. So what about opinion? Post-treatment, we asked a short battery of public opinion items measuring support for spending on 4 redistributive social programs and creating a single measure. So if upward comparison causes status perceptions to fall, which we just saw that it did, does it also increase support for redistribution? The short answer is yes. Subjects become more supportive of spending increases on redistributive programs when they're assigned to the upward comparison condition. All right, so if the rich are pulling away from the rest, and if people are so deeply sensitive, as I've just shown, to class divides, why aren't we seeing a massive shift in public opinion like we observe in our experiments? So in the second half of the book, we argue that income differences are not the only thing changing with inequality. So we focus on 3 countervailing trends. Class segregation keeps people from looking up. Economic anxiety makes us want to look down to feel better. And upward comparison, when it does happen, depresses efficacy. Okay, so now we'll look at the availability of the target and specifically at economic segregation. So here I'm wondering how much upward comparison actually happens in the real world outside of our experiment. This is Rob Wright in his classic Secession of the Successful paper saying Americans have one thing in common with their neighbors: they have similar incomes. This is increasingly true. That was written in 1991. It's more true today than it was then. In the United States, we really see the segregation of affluence as the defining characteristic of geographic income segregation. We see this in neighborhoods, in schools, in workplace networks, in social institutions like marriage. So a lot of this research, when we think about it from a public opinion standpoint, tends to ask how class segregation affects the empathy of the elite. If these elite people these wealthy don't have contact with everyone else, are they then, is their empathy kind of interrupted? Are they then less supportive of redistribution? But we actually ask a different question. How does class segregation affect attitude formation for everyone else? The fact that we don't have this readily available wealthy other in our environments. So it turns out that exposure to the wealthy makes people more accurate about status. We examine, this is with the General Social Survey data as well, so we examine the relationship between residential income segregation and status perceptions and public opinion using observational data from the GSS, and we match respondents to their zip codes, and then we take advantage of data that was very generously provided to us by Bill Franco and Pat Flavin. They've calculated the ratio of individuals on the 80th and 20th percentiles living in all U.S. zip codes. So this measure is scaled such that higher values mean that you're in a zip code or in a local area where there are many more rich people relative to to poor people, and vice versa. Okay, so using these data, we show that non-wealthy people, so here you're looking at a non-Hispanic white person in a household with a household income of $30,000, so a low-income person, they have a more accurate perception of their relative status when they live in zip codes where they're more likely to encounter the affluent other. So furthermore, we find suggestive evidence that lower-income Americans living in such zip codes are more supportive of redistribution than those who live in zip codes where the rich are relatively invisible. This model controls for a lot, including partisanship and ideology. So further, we show that lower-income non-Hispanic white Americans have higher and therefore less accurate status perceptions when they live in more racially integrated zip codes. So in effect, white Americans get an extra boost to how they see themselves from the presence of a racialized other in their community. We see similar results for the GSS questions that closely match some of our public opinion items in our experiments. So it looks like there's some suggestive evidence here that in the real world social comparison is functioning like it does in the experimental context. So beyond contact, we argue that economic anxiety, which has also increased as inequality has grown, may play a similarly insulating role. So social comparison serves a number of helpful functions for people psychologically. Social psychologists have shown that downward comparison really help us cope and manage difficult situations. So there are really interesting studies on people in so many different contexts, from women receiving breast cancer diagnoses to students taking math tests, situations where people tend to feel badly and anxious, where they choose downward comparison as a way to feel better and comfort themselves. So we're wondering here whether something similar happens with economic inequality. So does thinking about the rich might make us angry and resentful, but it also is really uncomfortable. And so if it's distressing, maybe we look downward to feel the squeeze. So the next research question in the book is, does anxiety make us want to look down, limiting our own upward comparison in our minds, no matter what the context is? So what we do here is we sort of first describe how economically anxious and insecure Americans feel, and this is, I think, true across many national contexts. Americans would prefer financial stability over moving up the income ladder, and a third report trouble just paying household expenses. This, pops around depending on what's happening with the economy, of course, but not as much as you might think. People, even when the economy is better or worse, sort of in the United States are feeling, you see this in our political rhetoric, are feeling insecure and like we're not doing well. Okay, so we have an experiment that we adapted from Albertson and Guderian, where we just basically asked people to list their economic worries. So first, we'd like you to take a moment to think about the economy, money, and your personal finances. So here we are asking them to think about like egotropic and sociotropic economic valuations. What makes you worried? Please list everything that comes to mind. Okay, so we're manipulating anxiety, economic anxiety here, by just asking people to list their worries. People have no trouble doing this. People of all incomes actually are relatively forthcoming. So people say all of these things. They vary a little bit depending on people's actual situations, but almost everybody is able to generate lots of economic worries. So then subjects are instructed to think of the MacArthur ladder as representing where people stand in the United States. We tell them we're going to ask them to read about somebody at one end of the ladder and compare themselves to that person, and we're going to ask them questions. So they know they're going to have to compare, and we ask them, who they'd like to compare themselves to. So we're looking for their preference here. And as expected, people who are primed to feel in the economic anxiety are more likely to prefer downward comparison to boost their sense of self. So perhaps these dynamics feel familiar. Trump seems to grasp the power of social comparison, and he uses downward comparison really regularly to boost the perceived status of his supporters. There are some examples of how he does this on the slides. I want to note one final factor before we kind of come back to elite rhetoric that insulates American politics from increasing inequality. So social comparison theory not only suggests that individuals use social comparisons to make sense of their status and their opinions, what they want, but also their abilities and their capacities to act and perform across domains of human experience. So upward comparison makes people feel small. Does it also make people feel politically less than and less capable? So we conducted another set of studies examining how social comparison affects political efficacy. And the things I'm going to show you, we measure efficacy using a standard internal political efficacy scale. So what you're going to see, the outcome here is a factor score of agreement with these 4 statements. And the book focuses on internal political efficacy because it most clearly corresponds with the sense of capability that psychologists had previously shown moves with social comparison, and because other scholars have repeatedly demonstrated its close relationship with socioeconomic status. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you one set of these results. So here's a study where we include upward and downward treatments, as well as that ladder-only condition where people are just looking at the MacArthur 10-rung ladder and not asked to think about the top or the bottom. The results are striking. So those assigned to upward comparison express lower levels of efficacy compared to all other groups. So in a democracy, preferences are important, but you could argue only in so much as people who hold them are mobilized to make demands and act. And that's really where efficacy comes in. So here we've identified a third countervailing force that insulates American politics from social comparison and inequality perception. So the very same messages, if you think about it, the very same messages and experiences that induce people to want more from government to address inequality are making them feel less confident and capable about their ability to make those demands. In the book, we present some suggestive evidence that this depression seems especially pronounced amongst those who are underrepresented in the political sphere, and that white men may be uniquely immune to this suppressive effect. They're in some exploratory heterogeneity analyses, the white men don't experience this same efficacy drop in relationship to upward comparison. So I began with several unanswered questions about the nation and inequality in general. So I'm trying to ask here, under what conditions do Americans consider the economically mighty or the weak? What do they think about when they compare themselves to others across the class divide? How do those contrasts make them feel about themselves? And what, if anything, do they want government to do about it all? And attention to social comparison, its prevalence and its our responses to it, and in some cases our resistance to it, gives us new answers and uncovers an important way in which inequality is reinforcing. Social comparison is an important power resource, and it is wielded with intention by political actors. Trump's rhetoric is filled with social comparison. And Biden, who historically had refrained from this kind of social comparative rhetoric, joined more populist Democrats in adding social comparison to his arguments, winning in 2020. Here's a quote from the first presidential debate where he's speaking in explicitly social comparative terms, asking people to look up and saying that he, like others, feels looked down upon, condescended to by people like Trump, who are very wealthy, saying you're being looked down on. Kamala Harris largely avoided social comparative rhetoric in favor of more universal language, focusing on similarity and unity. And I'm not making a strong claim that that's why the election went the way it did, but it is a notable difference between her rhetoric and some of her other Democratic peers. So in new work, Amber and I trace the prevalence of these explicitly comparison-based populist messages, and we test their effects. Our findings suggest that, we offer people in an experiment, similar experiments, a prompt instead of just asking them to look up interpersonally. We offer them a prompt asking them to look up that's modeled after much of the rhetoric on the American political left, asking people to look up the kind of Bernie Sanders type rhetoric. And our findings suggest that interpersonal social comparison through this kind of message and elite social comparison here, elite-driven, work relatively similarly. So this kind of message may well persuade. So here you see in this study we have both spending, like the book, and then we also look at preferences on the taxation of the rich. We see a really similar dynamic, but upward social comparison from elite rhetoric can also be uncomfortable and demobilizing. And in particular, we see a depression of external political efficacy in this new working paper. So there's little controversy, I think, about the fact that economic inequality is a central feature of the contemporary political landscape. I don't have to convince people in this room of the importance. And my aim has been to investigate how people perceive it, and in doing so, to offer a different way to address puzzles about the response to inequality. And it's our hope in writing this book that theorists and practitioners of democracy both will listen closely for social comparison as we probe the inner workings of economic difference and perception and politics. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.